Not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attack. Let us begin without softening the truth. What they did to you was not miscommunication. It was not two sides of a story. It was not immaturity or emotional confusion. It was intentional. There is something uniquely disturbing about watching someone calmly dismantle another person's name, not in a moment of rage, not in a burst of emotion, but in a slow, calculated way, word by word, conversation by conversation. They studied your silence. They weaponized your restraint. They mistook your dignity for defenselessness. They did not argue with you directly. Instead, they moved quietly through circles, planting impressions, suggesting instability, hinting at cruelty, framing themselves as wounded. And because you did not rush to defend yourself publicly, they believed the narrative would settle in their favor. They were not merely criticizing you. They were attempting to erase you. And the most disturbing part of all, they targeted someone who did not deserve it, which raises the deeper question that lingers in quiet moments. Why would they attack an innocent person? This is the question that lingers long after the noise fades. Not the public version, not the simplified explanation, but the private, aching one you may have whispered in prayer. Why would someone go that far against me? You did not betray them. You did not sabotage them. You did not scheme. Yet their hostility felt wildly disproportionate, almost irrational. That's because it was never about what you did. It was about what you represent. There is something profoundly unsettling to a narcissistic personality when they encounter someone who doesn't need to dominate to feel secure. Someone who doesn't compete for attention, doesn't collapse under pressure, can disagree without losing composure. You carried steadiness. Steadiness exposes instability. You responded with restraint. Restraint exposes impulsiveness. You lived from conviction, not image. Conviction exposes performance. Your very existence became a living contradiction to the fragile narrative they depend on to survive. Your calmness made their chaos visible. Your integrity quietly revealed their manipulation, even when you never spoke a word against them. Innocence becomes threatening, not by attacking, but by simply existing. When they cannot control you emotionally, cannot provoke you into collapse, cannot bend your identity to fit their script, they experience a loss of power. For someone whose identity is built on control, that loss feels like annihilation. So instead of facing their insecurity, they project it outward. Envy becomes your arrogance. Resentment becomes your cruelty. Their own inadequacy becomes you being too much. They did not attack you because you were weak. They attacked you because you were not. You didn't depend on their approval. You didn't crumble under intimidation. You didn't beg for validation. You held dignity, and dignity cannot be manipulated. To someone who thrives on bending others, that is intolerable. When private domination failed, they moved to a public battlefield, planting subtle distortions, raised eyebrows, carefully worded implications. Not loud lies at first, just surgical suggestion, repeated over time. Destroying your image doesn't require shouting. It requires timing and persistence. Yet this dynamic carries a tragic irony. The more decent you remain, the more threatened they feel. Your innocence reminds them of their compromise. Your clarity disarms their ambiguity. Your self-control highlights their instability. Throughout history, light has often been attacked, not because it is naive, but because it exposes darkness simply by contrasting with it. Light doesn't argue with darkness, it reveals it. They constructed a narrative to regain control, not to correct you, but to silence the quiet reminder that they could neither control you nor become you. Here is the painful, hopeful truth. When someone attacks an innocent person, they overplay their hand. Their aggression grows too visible, their obsession too obvious, their bitterness too sharp. In trying to dismantle you, they begin dismantling their own mask. You were not targeted because you were defective. You were targeted because you were intact. You were not attacked because you were chaotic. You were attacked because you were stable. And stability, in the presence of deep insecurity, can feel like an accusation, even when it is simply your existence. They rewrote the story and played the victim. After the attack, something even more unsettling unfolded. They didn't remain openly hostile. They shifted roles almost overnight. The aggressor became the injured party. The one who had quietly dismantled your name now spoke in tones of disappointment, sorrow, even moral concern. They didn't declare war, they implied suffering, and that made it devastatingly effective. Outright cruelty is easy to spot. Curated victimhood is far more persuasive. They didn't invent wild lies. They rearranged reality. They stripped away context. They spotlighted your human moments when you were tired, when you set a firm boundary, when you refused to tolerate disrespect, and reframed them as proof of flawed character. A boundary became coldness. Discernment became judgment. Self-respect became selfishness. Silence became guilt. It was subtle distortion, not dramatic slander. And subtle distortion travels farther. They spoke with apparent restraint, sighs instead of shouts, hints instead of accusations. When asked what happened, they shared just enough. Enough to suggest you were unstable, enough to imply they had endured quietly, enough to cast themselves as the long-suffering one who tried their best. That is how narratives reshape, not through explosion, but through careful, repeated suggestion. Repetition breeds familiarity. Familiarity breeds belief. For a season, it felt disorienting, like watching someone tell a story about you in which you didn't recognize yourself. Your name attached to qualities foreign to your heart. Conversations in rooms you weren't in. Glances that shifted without reason. You wondered, should I defend myself more forcefully? Was silence a mistake? Did restraint look like guilt? But here is the key truth. When someone commits to playing the victim, confrontation only feeds the performance. Victimhood requires an opponent. They needed your reaction, anger, frustration, panic, something they could point to and say, "See, this is what I endured." So they provoked indirectly, exaggerated tales hoping you'd correct them publicly, misrepresentations hoping you'd chase the narrative, hints at secrets, hoping you'd defend in haste. But you didn't, and that unsettled them most. When the victim receives no visible attack, the script begins to fray. Still, their story held sway for a time, the painful middle chapter. You felt the hesitation in others, the growing distance, the quiet evaluation based on information you never gave consent to share. Hostility face-to-face is one thing. Hostility through whisper is another. Whisper leaves no fingerprints. It thrives on suggestion. Yet, suggestion, like fog, cannot withstand sustained light. A rewritten story demands constant maintenance. Every retelling must stay consistent. Every new listener requires the same version. But every time you remained composed, their portrait of you clashed harder with reality. The performance cost energy. Eventually, strain showed, bitterness edged into tone. Obsession appeared in how often your name resurfaced. Inconsistencies slipped through cracks. People notice. Mature listeners sense the difference between processing pain and weaponizing it. Authentic hurt seeks healing. Weaponized hurt seeks control. As time passed, the repetition grew disproportionate. Why was the wound still so raw? Why so much focus on your faults and so little self-reflection? Genuine victimhood doesn't need constant advertisement. That's where the first fracture appeared. Listeners began to feel unease, not outright accusation, just a quiet misalignment. The intensity didn't match the events. The emotion felt rehearsed. Once even one person senses that shift, sympathy turns to scrutiny, and scrutiny is fatal to a fragile script. You may not have seen it happen, conversations you never heard, raised eyebrows you never witnessed. But it was occurring. The more they invested in securing their wounded image, the more their fixation became visible. What was meant as self-protection began to look like obsession. What was framed as defense started resembling character assassination. Slowly, without any dramatic showdown, the room changed. Truth has quiet resilience. It doesn't need to shout to survive. It simply endures. When a distorted narrative can no longer keep pace with lived reality, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. They tried to rewrite the story, but stories built on distortion eventually contradict themselves. And when they do, the author stands alone inside it. That quiet, gradual turning point, not your defense, not retaliation, but the moment their performance becomes unsustainable, is the beginning of exposure. Lies always leak. There is a truth about deception that reveals itself only up close. A lie is never static. It must be fed, protected, adjusted, and in that constant maintenance, it begins to fracture. At first, their narrative felt seamless, delivered with calm restraint, wrapped in just enough detail to seem credible without inviting scrutiny. But lies are unstable. They rely on consistency from someone internally inconsistent. That tension cannot hold forever. Over time, subtle cracks emerge. The tone sharpens. References to you grow more frequent and unprompted. What began as quiet sorrow starts feeling rehearsed, the sighs heavier, the indignation more pronounced. Observers notice the peculiar pattern. If you were truly the aggressor, why the ongoing obsession? If they've moved on, why does your name still surface in unrelated conversations? If the story is settled, why the constant reinforcement? These questions rarely surface aloud. They form quietly in minds, but once present, they linger. Genuine pain evolves. It softens with time, doesn't intensify through repetition. Yet their version grows more dramatic, not less. Inconsistencies appear small at first, a shifted detail, a reinterpreted motive, a changed timeline. They may not notice their own revisions. Belief eventually replaces memory, and accuracy erodes. But listeners remember the original version. They sense the exaggeration creeping in. That's when the leak starts. Not with dramatic exposure, but with doubt. Doubt is deception's first crack. Once it enters, control weakens. Doubt spreads through patterns, not campaigns. Obsession disguised as injury, disproportionate intensity, bitterness resurfacing without cause. Reasonable people measure reactions against events. When the scale tips, when hostility feels active rather than resolved, when emphasis stays on your faults, with little self-reflection, suspicion arises naturally. The narrative strains under its own weight. Composure cracks in frustration. Restraint slips when lightly questioned. Defensiveness reveals what heartbreak once hid. What was framed as survival begins to look like strategy. What was caution starts resembling pursuit. There is a clear difference between someone who was hurt and someone still hunting. The longer the story is maintained, the sharper that difference becomes. Lies demand relentless energy. Energy leaves traces. Fatigue causes slips, a flash of contempt amid sorrow. Sharpness contradicting gentle words, eagerness to tarnish that feels more like vendetta than healing. Observers begin comparing their volatility versus your steadiness, their repeated storytelling versus your quiet composure. their defensiveness versus your lack of retaliation. Contrast exposes what argument cannot. Light doesn't accuse darkness, it simply reveals its absence. Slowly, the narrative loses authority, not because you dismantled it, but because it couldn't withstand time. Time amplifies inconsistencies. Time magnifies patterns. Time tests motives. Motives cannot hide forever. The more they repeat to reinforce, the more repetition itself becomes suspicious. The more they insist, the more listeners step back. The more they dramatize, the more credibility erodes. Reinforcement turns to overexposure. Protection turns to emotional excess. In that excess, truth surfaces not loudly, but as quiet realization. People see not just what was said, but how it was framed. They see someone unable to let go, unable to accept loss of control, needing your suffering to feel stable. That realization roots deeply. It isn't kind or flattering. It isn't easily dismissed. Once it takes hold, the narrative cannot reclaim its former strength. Lies always leak, not because truth shouts, but because deception collapses under the weight of its own maintenance. You may not have witnessed the cracks forming. You may have felt isolated in the middle chapter, wondering if the distortion would ever fade. But the weakening was underway in thoughtful pauses, raised eyebrows, subtle shifts of tone, quiet conversations. Once a lie begins to leak, it doesn't rebuild. It crumbles not violently, but inevitably. When the truth becomes visible, truth rarely arrives with thunder. It gathers quietly, piece by piece, until its weight can no longer be ignored. For a long time, the air around you felt like fog, confusion, mixed perceptions, shifting loyalties. You sensed something unsettled, but the full shape remained unclear. Then the change began. Not from any campaign on your part, not from public exposure or dramatic evidence, but from the simple accumulation of patterns. One person recalled a contradiction. Another noticed the tone. Someone else weighed your steady behavior against the painted image. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fog thinned. There is a sacred moment when scattered doubts align into clarity. It often starts internally. A former sympathizer hesitates, a friend questions privately, a one-sided conversation suddenly carries quiet skepticism. Once that shift begins, it spreads because truth moves without force. It resonates. People revisit earlier assumptions. They replay conversations. They reconsider your composure, your integrity, your refusal to retaliate. They ask themselves, if this person were truly what I was told, would they remain so composed? Would they live with such consistent dignity? Would they resist the urge to defend aggressively? Contrast sharpens perception. What once seemed plausible now feels exaggerated. What sounded sincere now feels rehearsed. What appeared wounded now appears driven. And in that moment, the realization crystallizes. You were not the aggressor, you were the target. That truth carries deep emotional weight. Deception is one thing, but the deliberate targeting of someone acting in good faith unsettles people at a moral level. It feels wrong. Most adults have an internal compass that responds to injustice, even if quietly. When they see the imbalance, the disproportionate hostility, the calculated storytelling, the persistent fixation, it disturbs them. You did not deserve it. You were not manipulating. You were not scheming. You were simply living, and someone tried to dismantle that life through narrative. Once visible, sympathy shifts. It no longer flows to the storyteller. It flows to the one who endured quietly. The emotional atmosphere changes. Confusion, clarity. Clarity, discomfort. Discomfort, indignation. People resent being misled. They resent having their empathy exploited. They resent discovering that vulnerability was strategy. There is a particular anger for relational deception, the weaponizing of trust. This anger begins quietly, shortened conversations, reduced warmth, subtle withdrawal of support. But beneath it lies a firm re-evaluation of character. And once character is re-evaluated, reputation follows. You may not witness dramatic apologies or confessions, but you will sense the shift. Eyes soften, conversations feel less guarded, warmth returns without explanation. Truth restores balance. The definition they tried to impose on you begins to dissolve. The distortion they tried to cement erodes. Something almost poetic emerges. The more consistently you remain who you are, the clearer the misalignment becomes in hindsight. Your restraint was not guilt, it was composure. Your silence was not admission, it was strength. Your refusal to escalate was not weakness, it was maturity. This realization carries force, not because it glorifies you, but because it exposes the ugliness of what was done. Truth does not merely correct facts, it corrects perspective. And perspective determines loyalty. You were once questioned, now you are understood. You were once viewed through suspicion, now through recognition. In that recognition lies quiet vindication, not from revenge, but from endurance. The attacker believed exposure would bury you. Instead, it clarified you. The storyteller believed repetition would cement the narrative. Instead, repetition revealed obsession. As the final pieces settle, the room feels different. No dramatic announcement, no loud declaration. Just a collective, unspoken understanding. What was done was unjust, and you did not deserve it. That is the power of visible truth. It does not restore you by attacking them. It restores you by revealing reality. Once reality is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. That is the moment the narrative loses its hold. That is when everything shifts quietly, inevitably, undeniably. The backlash, they cannot control. There comes a point where momentum shifts, not forced, not announced, but inevitable. Trust, once cracked, collapses under its own weight. When truth becomes visible, consequences arrive quietly but precisely. At first, the narcissist may not fully grasp it. They sense a change but cannot name it. Conversations shorten, invitations dwindle, warmth cools to polite distance, laughter thins. Nothing explosive, just absence. And absence speaks louder than accusation. The circles that once amplified their voice now create space around them. Listeners who once affirmed now withhold full endorsement. Friends who once nodded now listen with caution. Influence doesn't vanish overnight, it shrinks. And shrinking influence is suffocating to someone whose oxygen is control. Panic sets in subtly. They may intensify the narrative, revisit the story for reassurance, probe the room for validation. But the emotional climate has shifted. Responses carry hesitation. Nods hide skepticism. Words no longer land with automatic authority. That loss of credibility feels catastrophic. Trust cannot be commanded back, it must be earned. Yet the very traits that fueled the attack, manipulation, projection, exaggeration, are the same traits blocking repair. Defensiveness replaces humility. Blame replaces reflection. Irritation replaces repentance. People are not misunderstanding. They are understanding more clearly than ever. Clarity breeds distance. Distance breeds isolation. Isolation breeds exposure. They encounter subtle resistance, conditional invitations, shallow conversations, rooms that no longer revolve around them. Charm is tried, humor is attempted, selective vulnerability is offered. But once credibility erodes, every gesture is filtered. Filtered perception exhausts someone accustomed to unfiltered acceptance. The backlash is not violent. It is quiet withdrawal, the slow closing of doors, the steady reduction of influence. For someone defined by narrative dominance, this is suffocating. They cannot confront it openly without confirming suspicion. They cannot demand loyalty without revealing insecurity. They cannot defend aggressively without reinforcing the pattern that caused the backlash. They are trapped by their own strategy. The most sobering truth: you are not orchestrating this. You are not campaigning, gathering allies, or seeking revenge. You are simply living. Meanwhile, the social fabric reweaves itself without their dominance at the center. They believed destroying your reputation would elevate theirs. Instead, it exposed their character. They believed isolating you would consolidate power. Instead, it revealed obsession. They believed rewriting the story would secure sympathy. Instead, it triggered scrutiny. And scrutiny is merciless toward deception. In mature environments, people recognize manipulation signs quickly. They may not confront dramatically, but they withdraw intentionally. That withdrawal becomes their new reality. Subtle coolness, absence of unquestioned support, building anxiety beneath the surface. When identity depends on perception, loss of control feels like collapse. This is not revenge. This is consequence. And consequence unfolds naturally when truth displaces distortion, no involvement from you required. While they grapple with diminishing influence, your steadiness stands out in sharper contrast. You did not fracture, you did not retaliate, you did not chase image through aggression, you endured. Endurance, over time, becomes undeniable credibility. The backlash they cannot control is not loud condemnation, it is quiet re-evaluation, subtle detachment, steady erosion of trust that charm alone cannot rebuild. In that erosion lies a profound shift. Influence fades, image weakens, identity trembles. Instability follows. When someone built on control loses its foundation, they may mask it with confidence, but internally the loss is felt deeply. The room no longer bends, the narrative no longer dominates, sympathy no longer flows freely. Silence, once their weapon, now works against them. It is no longer read as guilt, it is read as strength, and your quiet resilience has become the measure by which everything else is judged. This backlash is irreversible. Once people see clearly, they do not easily return to blindness. Once trust breaks, it does not reassemble effortlessly. Once character is exposed, it does not hide comfortably again. They attacked an innocent person believing it would consolidate power. Instead, it diminished theirs permanently. Without dramatic confrontation, perception has shifted. The balance of the room has rearranged. And once truth begins to rearrange reality, no one can stop it. Your name is being restored. There is a moment that arrives without fanfare. No trumpet, no public apology, no crowded room confession. It happens in silence. One day, you notice the tension has lifted, not erased from memory but gone from the atmosphere. The faint hesitation in people's eyes disappears. The subtle measuring ends. The quiet distance closes. Something has shifted, and you did not force it. Restoration rarely feels like triumph. It feels like relief. For a time, your name carried an unnatural weight. It felt heavy in rooms where it once flowed naturally. Conversations dipped when you entered. Invitations grew sparse. You sensed the silent evaluation. That strain tests the soul, not because you doubt yourself, but because prolonged misunderstanding tempts even the strongest to defend loudly. But you didn't. You chose stillness, not passivity. Stillness is deliberate strength. It trusts that character speaks clearer than outrage ever could. It trusts time to reveal what words cannot. While they talked, you lived. While they adjusted their narrative, you stayed consistent. While they managed impressions, you guarded your integrity. People notice consistency not instantly, but gradually. They see how you respond under pressure. They see how you treat those who offer no advantage. They see how you carry yourself without applause. Character shines in ordinary moments. Those moments accumulate. Someone notices your composure never cracks. Another observes your tone never matches the described hostility. Someone else realizes you never spoke ill of your accuser. That recognition carries weight. Maturity honors restraint. Refusing to weaponize pain confuses those expecting retaliation. It unsettles those anticipating a fight. You offered calm instead of chaos, silence instead of exposure, steadiness instead of revenge. Over time, steadiness builds credibility. You may never hear the private reconsiderations. You know, I don't think that story holds up. But those moments occur when lived experience contradicts repeated narrative, when exaggeration fails to match reality, when the unstable one remains remarkably grounded. Contrast becomes undeniable. Suspicion turns to dignity. Questionable becomes resilient. Doubt becomes respect. Your name is restored not through noise, but through recognition. A quiet authority forms when someone survives distortion without becoming distorted. You did not let bitterness redefine you. You did not let humiliation shrink you. You did not let injustice harden you. People evaluate not only what happened, but who you became afterward. And you became stronger, not louder, stronger. Strength needs no audience approval. It demands no correction. It chases no validation. It simply stands. And when it stands long enough, it becomes obvious. The attack meant to destabilize you, clarified you. The effort to undermine your credibility revealed your character. The attempt to isolate you highlighted your independence. You are not restored because they failed. You are restored because you remained grounded, consistent, true. The room feels different now. No cloud lingers over your name. No undertone of doubt. Only clarity. And clarity needs no announcement, it is felt. Your name is spoken with steadiness again. That steadiness was tested. It endured. It survived. And now it stands stronger than before. The attack not because you fought harder, but because you refused to become what they accused you of being. That is restoration. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but real. And real restoration brings a peace no public vindication could ever match. The final lesson: when someone attacks an innocent person, here is the truth you can carry forward. When someone attacks an innocent person, they do not destroy that person's character, they expose their own. You may have been wounded. You may have been misrepresented. You may have walked through seasons of silence that felt unfair, but you were not defined by the accusation. You were refined by the pressure. The greatest mistake a narcissist can make is targeting someone who refuses to become bitter, because when you do not collapse, when you do not retaliate, when you do not lose yourself, the contrast becomes undeniable. And contrast reveals truth. Let this be your peace. You do not have to chase vindication. You do not have to manage every opinion. You do not have to defend your integrity to those committed to misunderstanding you. Live steadily. Speak carefully. Stand firmly. Time, consistency, and character will do what outrage never could. What they did was ugly, but who you are is unshaken. And in the end, that is what remains.